Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Tales from the Crypt, Season 3. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The first story begins with a man named Edward finishing a day's work and returning home to his gentle and virtuous wife. They decided to have a drink to celebrate Edward's promotion and raise. After a drink, his wife began to undress, eager for intimacy. Suddenly, the scene shifted. It was all part of a script. In reality, Edward is a frustrated screenwriter with no steady job and a difficult life. With such conditions, having a wild, beautiful wife was out of the question. Edward's apartment had no water, so he spoke to the building manager, who never showed his face, but curtly responded through the intercom. In the laundry room, Edward met his new neighbor, Miranda, who looked exactly like the heroine in his script. He fell for her instantly, especially her sexy body. After leaving the laundry room, the building manager informed Edward that his faucet was fixed and mentioned that Miranda lived in apartment 509. Edward gathered his courage and visited Miranda. She was on the phone, and it turned out she was an actress who had starred in Beach Babes 2, a title that sounded a bit odd. Learning they both came from Indiana, Miranda invited Edward for a drink that evening. Thrilled by the invitation, Edward dressed up and brought flowers. However, Miranda arrived at the apartment with another man, completely forgetting about her date with Edward. Crushed, Edward was unaware that the building manager had been watching their every move, mocking Edward's unrequited feelings. The next morning, Edward ran into Miranda again in the elevator. Miranda remembered their date from the previous night and, to apologize, invited Edward over for a drink. Edward told her he was a screenwriter and promised to write a script that would make her a star. Miranda was indifferent until her phone rang with news of a new role. She eagerly told the caller she was willing to audition in the nude if necessary. Unbeknownst to Miranda, Edward, lost in his fantasies, began to grope her. Furious, Miranda slapped him and threw his butt out. Rejected, Edward was despondent for a while. That evening, as usual, Edward slipped his rent payment under the manager's door. To his surprise, the manager invited him in. The walls were covered with photos of beautiful women. The enigmatic manager lit a cigarette and, aware of Edward's torment, offered him a love potion. He claimed that just one sip from Miranda and she would fall madly in love with Edward. Eager to make amends, Edward brought over some wine and spiked Miranda's drink with the potion. As soon as she drank it, Miranda became infatuated with Edward, and they spent the hormone night together. They enjoyed a period of happiness, but over time, Miranda's desires became overwhelming. Edward soon found himself terrified at the sight of her. Miranda, however, showed no signs of letting him go. Poor Edward was exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. Even domestic violence couldn't shake Miranda's love. Desperate, Edward turned to the manager for help. The manager revealed that there was no antidote for the love potion, except to kill Miranda. Edward then realized that the women in the photos were all previous victims of the potion. The manager gave Edward a green vial, which he secretly mixed into Miranda's drink. He handed Miranda the tainted glass and went to read the script she had just finished writing. Miranda noticed Edward's glass was dirty, and thinking she should drink from the dirty one, she switched their glasses. They toasted, and Edward drank the poison, dying instantly. In the afterlife, Edward believed he had finally escaped Miranda. But to his horror, Miranda, unable to bear Edward's death, jumped out of a window and killed herself, trying to be together with Edward forever. Edward let out a desperate scream in a chicken voice. The second story begins with Raymond, who is a notorious criminal. One day, he robs a bank and drives towards the Mexican border. The radio broadcast reveals that Raymond is a recent prison escapee. Having barely escaped, he shows no intention of lying low and instead continues his crime spree by robbing a bank. While Raymond thinks he can get away scot-free, a police officer on a scooter starts chasing him, firing shots. A gunfight ensues, and the officer falls off his scooter, which then crashes into Raymond's car. Raymond narrowly escapes death, but his vehicle is destroyed. Now, he has to walk with his stolen money. A vulture, attracted by the explosion, circles around Raymond, seemingly waiting for a feast. Meanwhile, the injured officer regains consciousness and, showing great dedication, continues to pursue Raymond despite the harsh conditions. After some time, the officer catches up with Raymond. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Raymond abandons his money, hoping to bribe the officer. However, the officer scatters the money, refusing the bribe. Raymond resumes his escape, with the vulture still trailing him. Raymond sees a sign indicating he's only 2 miles from the Mexican border, a glimmer of hope suggesting he might evade justice. On the other side, the officer, having lost sight of Raymond, sits down and prays to God to show him the way. At that moment, the vulture lands beside him, guiding the officer to the sign Raymond had just passed. The officer exclaims since he now knows which way to go. Raymond arrived at a bar, but it had been abandoned for a long time. The place was empty, and not even a drop of water came from the taps. The police officer caught up with Raymond. They wrestled their muscles, and a fierce fight ensued. Despite their thirst and exhaustion, their strength was still formidable. During the struggle, the officer managed to handcuff himself to Raymond. Not to be outdone, Raymond picked up a gun and shot the officer multiple times. In a final act of defiance, the officer swallowed the handcuff key, declaring that even if he died, he wouldn't get rid of him. With no water, no food, and no bullets left, Raymond was forced to drag the officer's corpse along with him. The vulture perched nearby, watching intently, further agitating Raymond. Determined, Raymond hoisted the officer's body and continued towards Mexico, talking incessantly to himself as he walked. As expected, Raymond soon exhausted his strength. The harsh desert weather worsened, and he used the officer's body to shield himself from a sandstorm, thinking that he would be in Mexico just over this hill. Carrying the officer's body, Raymond climbed the hill, dreaming of fast cars, beautiful women, and cold beer just 5 minutes away. However, as he reached the top, the officer's body caused him to tumble down the slope, undoing all his efforts. The vulture's low, mocking call echoed nearby. Refusing to give up, Raymond crafted a makeshift axe from a wooden stick and the officer's badge, intending to sever the officer's arm. But weakened and disoriented, he accidentally struck his own wrist instead. The pain was unbearable, and as he staggered backward, he lost his footing and fell down the slope again. The injury to his wrist was severe, causing it to break under his weight. Raymond tumbled down the cliff and lost consciousness. When he awoke, he was paralyzed. The eager vulture descended and, amidst Raymond's chicken screams, pecked out his eyes, thinking the man might be a delicious chicken. Raymond met a gruesome end, just one hill away from the Mexican border and the freedom he had dreamed of. Legends say vultures can smell death, but in this tale, the vulture didn't touch the officer's body. Even animals can distinguish between good and evil, while some humans persist in their dark paths. It's a profound irony. The third story begins with a bearded man, Lou, and his beardless wife, Irene, are a married couple. Lou has a bad temper, is lazy, and never holds a job for more than 3 days. This has led to severe financial difficulties for the couple, and they are also deeply in debt. Irene suggested that she could go out to earn money to support the family, but Lou, being very chauvinistic, believed that a woman's place was at home, serving her husband. With bills piling up, Lou told Irene to borrow money from her family. She retorted that her mother has been dead for years, asking if he wanted her to dig up her mother's grave. At this moment, Lou remembered his life insurance policy. Since they couldn't afford the premiums, he proposed a scheme, faking his death to deceive everyone and possibly score a large payout. Lou immediately called his younger brother Billy, who worked at a funeral home. Billy was reluctant to help with something illegal, but he had been bullied by Lou since childhood and was very timid. Under Lou's persistent threats, Billy and Irene reluctantly agreed to cooperate. Billy procured some human blood and used a knife to stage the crime scene. To make it more convincing, Lou handed Irene a fire poker and told her to knock him out. When Irene hesitated, Lou confessed to having an affair with her best friend last month. Billy, unable to listen any longer, picked up the fire poker and hit Lou several times. Despite having such a good wife, Lou had cheated on her. Lou passed out as planned, and they called the police. Billy and Irene reported that a robber had broken in and killed Lou. The lazy police officer took a cursory look at Lou's body. Irene told the officer that the assailant had also beaten Lou with the fire poker. Since the officer was very lazy and Billy was a funeral home worker with a coroner's license, the officer handed the fire poker to Billy to extract blood and fingerprint evidence. Thus, the 3 accomplices successfully fooled everyone and held a funeral for Lou. At the funeral, their mother cried hysterically. The mole on her face was identical to Lou's, proving their biological relationship. However, she was very cold towards Billy, even denying that he was her son, possibly because Billy didn't have a mole on his face. The police officer took away the emotionally unstable mother, leaving only the 3 of them at the funeral home. Billy and Irene, caught up in the moment, ended up kissing on Lou's coffin lid. Inside the coffin, Lou muttered, wondering why it was so noisy outside. That noise was his wife and brother performing a hormone yoga session right above him. Irene accidentally flipped a switch, causing the coffin to move towards the crematorium. Inside the coffin, Lou began to feel increasingly hot. At the last moment, Billy flipped the switch again, saving Lou's shitty life. The 3 conspirators then celebrated with champagne. Billy handed Lou $15,000, telling him to go abroad and lie low, suggesting he get plastic surgery. Once Irene received the insurance payout, she would join him abroad. Lou agreed and happily took the money, making his escape. After undergoing plastic surgery, Lou settled abroad. He waited for news from his wife, but heard nothing. Realizing he might have been tricked, he booked a flight home overnight. Upon arrival, he discovered that Irene had married his own brother. However, both Irene and Billy claimed not to recognize Lou. Irene called the police, accusing Lou of trespassing. Lou explained his fake death insurance fraud to the police, but the officer didn't believe his smelly bullshit, having seen Lou's body himself. Thus, Lou was bizarrely accused of murdering himself. Fingerprints on the weapon matched Lou's, and with tearful testimonies from Irene and Billy, the judge found Lou guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. On the day of his execution, the defiant Lou mocked the priest with a cheeky request, asking him to play a tune on his smelly sausage. Even facing death, Lou's passion for music shone through, a tragic yet poignant moment. With Lou out of the way, Irene and Billy lived happily ever after on the insurance money. Perhaps from the moment Irene and Billy developed feelings for each other, they planned to get rid of Lou. The fingerprints on the weapon and sending Lou abroad were all part of their scheme. Framing the surgically altered Lou as his own killer was their ultimate goal. This explains why they didn't actually cremate him at the very beginning. The fourth story begins with two brothers, Martin and Carl, being both medical students. One day, the younger brother Carl took Martin to the dissection room, seeking his insights on the circulatory system. He then unveiled a beautiful female corpse. Carl's inappropriate behavior with the corpse made Martin uncomfortable. He warned Carl that some people might seem dead, but could still have a functioning brain and be aware of their surroundings. Suddenly, the corpse sat up, grabbed Martin by the throat, and screamed for him not to touch her dead but still sexy body. Carl burst out laughing as their classmates entered the room with wine, revealing that it was all a prank for Martin's birthday. However, the prank went too far and triggered a heart attack in Martin. Panicking, Carl called for help, desperately shouting Martin's name. Time flew by, and several years had passed. Carl had grown up to become a doctor. He had cut his long hair, adopting a cold and decisive demeanor. Martin, however, had been left paralyzed on one side of his body due to that fateful prank, rendering him unable to practice medicine for the rest of his life. Despite the severe consequences of that prank, the bond between the two brothers remained strong. Perhaps out of guilt, Carl secured a teaching position for Martin and provided him with funds for research. One day, Martin poured a drink for his sibling and invited him to see his latest research. It turned out Martin had spent those years using the funds to study witchcraft. He had traveled to Haiti, witnessing firsthand how Haitian voodoo could supposedly bring the dead back to life. He firmly believed his research could revive a brain from the dead. As doctors who had always trusted in science, Carl was shocked and angered by his brother's foray into such bizarre and unscientific endeavors, considering it a waste of funds. Their argument escalated, and in his frustration, Carl turned to leave, only to clutch his chest in sudden pain. It became clear that the drink Martin had given him was tampered with. Watching his brother's agony, Martin began to accuse him, saying that the prank had cost him his dream and he could never forgive Carl for it. Then, he injected Carl with a newly developed green serum. Carl died instantly, or more accurately, his body died, but his brain remained active. He couldn't speak, move, or even have a heartbeat, but he could hear and see everything happening around him. Martin explained that according to his research, the sense of touch was the first to disappear. Carl now only had his hearing, sight, and cognitive abilities left, unable to feel any pain. To further his revenge, Martin contacted an organ donation agency, planning a live dissection for his brother. Sometime later, a doctor with dreadlocks prepared to open Martin's clinically dead body. Carl screamed internally, explaining what happened in the past was an accident, while this is murder. A series of pre-surgery procedures followed. Martin was hung in a refrigerated room like a piece of meat, bled, and injected with preservatives. Throughout this process, he felt no pain, confirming his sense of touch was indeed gone. Early the next morning, Martin brought his students to witness the dissection. He waved a cranial saw in the air, and Carl internally screamed for him to stop. Suddenly, his fingers twitched. Terrified, Carl sat up on the dissection table with a scream. The surrounding students burst into laughter and were not surprised to see Carl was still alive. It turned out Martin had played a prank on Carl. The blood on his face was fake, and the hooks were merely strong straps. Martin presented the green serum he had injected. It was his latest research. The serum, combined with a sedative in the drink, could protect the brain during a crisis lasting about 3 hours. However, it made time feel excruciatingly long, making those 3 hours seem like days. Realizing it was a prank, Carl laughed, saying they were even now. But then his heart began to ache painfully, and he collapsed onto the dissection table. Seeing his brother in critical condition, Martin quickly injected him again with the green serum to protect his brain. The scene shifts to two coroners performing an autopsy on Carl. It turns out that Martin's drug was still experimental, and he had no idea it would cause a heart attack. Thus, Carl died from cardiac arrest, and Martin ended up in prison. What the coroners didn't know was that the drug had preserved Carl's brain. Even in death, he could still see and hear everything. More horrifyingly, he also retained his sense of touch and could feel pain vividly. The story ends with Carl's screams echoing in the background. The fifth story begins with a hard-working actor named Barry, but his plain appearance kept him from getting any jobs. After yet another failed audition, Barry returned to his apartment in tears. There, he ran into an old colleague, Winton, who was strikingly handsome and had far more job opportunities because of it. He told Barry that this is an era where looks matter. Instead of honing his acting skills, maybe he should focus on making himself more attractive. The next day, Barry faced rejection again at a theater audition. The casting director suggested he get plastic surgery. Furious, Barry retorted him, saying he might not have the looks, but I had talent. The director ignored his bullshit, claiming that no one would care about his talent, and maybe he should consider getting some work done first. Barry was so broke that he could barely afford food, let alone plastic surgery. Dejected, he returned home seeking muscle comfort from his girlfriend, only to find she had left him for someone else. She was tired of their unstable life. Out of a sense of duty, she made a deal with the landlord to keep Barry from being thrown in jail for unpaid rent before leaving. With nowhere else to go, Barry was evicted by the landlord. Desperate, he noticed a flyer for a theater group looking for an actor to play Hamlet. Following the address, he arrived at a rundown theater, only to find Winton already there. Winton wasn't short on roles. He just wanted to prove that good looks were more important than talent. Both were invited into the theater. On stage, an actor playing Hamlet struggled with a plastic skull, failing to get into character. The eccentric director, frustrated, threw the actor off the stage. Winton couldn't help but mutter about the director's over-the-top and harsh methods, while Barry admired the director's pursuit of perfection. Barry volunteered to play Hamlet, but the director gave the role to Winton instead. Barry loudly questioned the director's decision. The director simply said, "Because he's good-looking." This wasn't the first time Winton had taken an opportunity from Barry. Winton told Barry that being an actor is like doing business. If he spent half as much energy figuring out how to break into this industry, he wouldn't be in this situation. Although Winton's words were meant to be helpful, they struck a nerve in Barry. In a fit of rage, Barry strangled Winton to death. He hid the body and lied to the director, saying Winton had given up the role. With no other choice, the director cast Barry as Hamlet. Overjoyed, Barry was backstage changing costumes and reciting his lines, but the director informed him that he wasn't cast as Hamlet. His role was Yorick. However, Yorick had already died before the story began. His only scene was as the skull in Hamlet's hand. Barry exclaimed how he was supposed to act that, but the director said they needed his skull exactly. It turned out the director and his team had been using real human skulls as props, but their latest skull had gone missing. They had lured Barry under the guise of an audition to find a new skull. Calling the madmen, Barry hid in another room. It turned out that the theater was next to a psychiatric hospital. Highly dangerous psychiatric patients had killed all the doctors, escaped, and taken refuge in the abandoned theater. The director had originally chosen Winton for his high cheekbones, but Barry had killed Winton out of jealousy. No matter, Barry's skull would suffice. Thus, Barry became the next victim. The actor holding Barry's skull quickly got into character, much to the director's satisfaction. The police eventually learned about the escaped mental patients, but Barry didn't survive long enough to be rescued. His body was discarded in a trash heap, only to be dragged away by a dog. His plain appearance was so unappealing that not even the dog cared much for it. The sixth story begins with a habitual criminal named Duval, who found himself on a war-torn island, hoping to meet the island's mysterious wealthy owner. Accompanying the tycoon was his beautiful mistress. Duval approached, offering to help manage the farm. His red hair, rare in the area, caught the mistress's peeping eye. She complimented his hair, while the tycoon observed Duval's delicate hands and remarked that he didn't seem suited for farm work. Duval noticed the tycoon's hands were covered in strange markings. The tycoon was unfazed by Duval's criminal past and explained that the island was in the midst of a revolution. If Duval wished, he could stay. He then took Duval to his estate, where a local witch had just finished a purification ritual for the tycoon. The witch was startled upon seeing Duval's red hair, a rare and significant symbol of life and power in their culture. Duval asked about the tycoon's hands. The witch explained that he was suffering from a severe parasitic infection. She showed Duval to his quarters, a simple room adorned with a ram's head. She reassured Duval that the ram's spirit would protect the room. After the witch left, Duval wandered the island, hearing distant gunfire. He entered the tycoon's collection room, filled with priceless black pearls, his true reason for coming. Wearing a dragon robe, the tycoon told Duval that some things' value couldn't be measured in money. The room had a security system, so Duval didn't dare make a move. Despite Duval's ulterior motives, the tycoon wasn't upset and expressed a desire to become friends. Later, Duval encountered the tycoon's mistress again. He had long desired her beauty and her sexy body, and she, tired of the frail old man, was equally eager for a decent hormone yoga session. They quickly became intimate and made a pact to steal the tycoon's black pearls together. That night, the witch came to Duval's bedside and warned him to stay away from the mistress, as she was extremely dangerous and would lead him to ruin. With the rebels about to take over the island, the tycoon hoped Duval could take his mistress away first. But Duval, determined to get his hands on the black pearl, wasn't willing to leave. He sneaked into the tycoon's residence and forced him to hand over the black pearl. The tycoon accused Duval of being too greedy. He had always considered Duval a friend and had even entrusted his beloved mistress to him. Disappointed that Duval was still not satisfied, the tycoon, anxious to escape, was shot dead by Duval in a moment of panic. However, the black pearl wasn't in the tycoon's bag. Duval guessed that the man might have swallowed it. So, in front of the mistress, he cut open the tycoon's stomach. The tycoon's body was covered in marks left by parasites, and even his insides were infested. Despite his disgust, Duval finally retrieved the black pearl from the man's stomach. But just then, the mistress pointed a gun at Duval. She had been with the tycoon for money and naturally wouldn't let go of the priceless pearl. As Duval's life hung in the balance, the witch, who had been waiting outside, used her magic to kill the mistress. The witch didn't want the black pearl. She only wanted to leave with Duval. They walked a long way together, and Duval spoke of how the black pearl represented not just money, but also power and respect. The witch laughed, saying that in her eyes, Duval's red hair was more valuable than anything because it could bring her respect from her people. Before Duval could react, the witch swiftly decapitated him. She discarded the black pearl and, carrying Duval's head, joyfully headed back to her tribe. As the tycoon said, some things' value cannot be measured by money. People in different environments have different values. Duval and the mistress both came for the tycoon's black pearl, which could bring them endless wealth and luxury. But the treasures in their eyes were worthless to the tycoon and the witch. To the tycoon, the mistress was his treasure, and even during the crisis, he entrusted her to Duval. To the witch, Duval's red hair was her treasure, bringing her tribe's respect, something money couldn't buy. The seventh story begins with a fat agent critiquing Jack's paintings, saying they were too bland and not worthy of an exhibition. The harsh criticism made Jack furious, and in his imagination, he smashed the agent's head with a hammer. In reality, Jack was unsuccessful at work and a very timid person in life. Fortunately, no matter how pathetic Jack was, his beautiful girlfriend always stayed by his side. The girl volunteered to be Jack's model, but no matter how she posed, Jack couldn't produce a satisfactory painting. Late at night, a hippie downstairs turned his music up loud and sang drunkenly on the stairs, disturbing Jack's work. During their argument, Jack accidentally hit the hippie with a bottle, causing him to fall to his death. Initially intending to flee, Jack found the scene of the bloodied hippie strangely beautiful. He took photos of the corpse and turned the death scene into an oil painting. At the same time, he saw in a magazine that a wealthy man was buying death and controversial collectibles at high prices. Taking a chance, Jack took the painting to meet the wealthy man, who had a peculiar taste and greatly admired Jack's work. He immediately wrote a check for $20,000 and bought the painting, saying Jack was teetering on the edge of darkness and ordering a second piece. For the always financially struggling Jack, this money was a godsend. Strangely, he didn't show any happiness, only confusion and fear. Back home, Jack lost all his inspiration again. He decided to go out for a drink and happened to run into the landlady downstairs. It turned out the landlady had witnessed Jack accidentally killing the hippie the night before. The landlady wasn't a good person either, often hinting at her dissatisfaction and threats toward Jack. Not one to be outdone, Jack killed her on the spot. Just like last time, he first took photos of the dead landlady and then collected her diabetic blood. Using the inspiration he gained from the murder, he created another extremely morbid painting. The next day, his girlfriend came to the studio. Jack hurriedly hid the photos and blood. His girlfriend hadn't been able to reach him for days and found him looking cold and sickly. Despite this, she still loved him as always. Their conversation led them to the bed, but Jack began to hallucinate and almost killed her. Realizing he couldn't go on like this, Jack took his painting to visit the rich man again. The second piece also sold for a good price, but this time Jack said he wouldn't continue painting. After Jack left, his bored girlfriend opened his cabinet and found evidence of his murders. Terrified, she fled the studio, but in her panic, she had a car accident and was critically injured. Jack loved her deeply and couldn't bear to see her die. The doctor said they had called in a specialist to perform surgery and believed they could save her. However, the lack of health insurance meant Jack faced hefty medical bills. He went to the hospital parking lot, selected a random passerby, and killed them, using the blood to create an impromptu abstract painting. He sold this painting to the rich man to cover the surgery costs. Rushing back to the hospital with the check, he received more bad news. The doctor who could save his girlfriend had been murdered a few hours earlier. Ironically, this left Jack helpless as he watched his girlfriend die before his eyes, becoming single once again. The police found one of Jack's paintbrushes at the crime scene, successfully identifying him as the killer. Gazing too long into the abyss gazed back, and dark emotions consumed Jack's once pure and kind heart, turning him into a deranged lunatic. The eighth story begins with a man named Donald who was a clever vampire. To hide his identity, he works as a night shift security guard at a blood bank. This job perfectly aligns with his schedule, and when he's hungry, he can conveniently have a drink. It's an ideal setup. Lately, the blood bank manager has been furious with the staff due to low inventory and has been taking it out on Sally, even harassing her. Just and righteous, Donald steps in to help. However, as a lowly night guard, he can only do so much to keep his job. Both Sally and Donald have worked at the blood bank for years and have developed feelings for each other. Unable to hold back anymore, Sally confesses her love to Donald. But knowing he is a vampire, Donald painfully rejects her. After Sally leaves, an excited Donald opens the blood bank to dine. He selects a variety of blood types and mixes them with a bit of lime juice to create his favorite flavor. To avoid the manager noticing the missing blood, he needs to alter the records, but soon realizes the manager has taken the logbook. To replenish the stock, Donald reluctantly goes out to hunt. But being a kind vampire, he can't bring himself to harm innocent people. Just then, a robber appears before him. Without hesitation, Donald captures the robber and starts a probing interrogation, asking him if he had diabetics or any infectious diseases and if he used drugs. After receiving negative answers, Donald inserts a tube into the robber's artery, draining all his blood. This not only replenishes the inventory, but also leaves Donald with a surplus. The next morning, Sally comes to work and confesses to Donald again. Just like before, Donald likes Sally, but his excitement reveals his fangs, pulling him back to reality. He quickly gathers his things and flees for his vampiric life. Life goes on day by day, but a series of murders naturally draws the police's attention. While the police are at their wits' end, a peculiar-looking man named Van Helsing arrives at the station. With a name like that, he must be a vampire hunter. Van Helsing explains that the victims in these cases were all drained of their blood, clearly the work of a vampire. But why do the victims only have one puncture wound on their necks? It seems that the vampire has a rotten tooth? He wondered why the vampire needed so much blood, thinking that the vampire might have a big appetite. However, the officer didn't buy his reasoning, skeptical of the whole situation. Switching scenes, the blood bank manager announces to everyone that due to a critical shortage, he must lay off a large number of staff unless the blood supply can be doubled. He also insinuates that if Sally wants to keep her job, she has to get close to him. For hundreds of years, Donald has wandered from place to place, and he finally managed to settle down here. To keep his job, Donald reluctantly transforms into a vampire vigilante, prowling the dark corners of the city at night. He constantly hunts down wrongdoers, eliminating threats to society while replenishing the blood bank's supply and satisfying his own hunger. The series of murders convinces Van Helsing that a vampire is responsible. Through Donald's relentless efforts, the blood bank eventually overcomes the crisis, and all employees keep their jobs. Meanwhile, Van Helsing uncovers some clues. Someone at the blood bank has ordered soil from Transylvania, the homeland of vampires, which they need to rest. Van Helsing decides to visit the blood bank where Donald works, accompanied by a police officer. The scene shifts to Donald returning home after finishing his work, only to find the manager waiting with a gun. It turns out the manager discovered Donald's vampiric nature years ago and fabricated the blood shortage to trick Donald into bringing in more fresh blood. Now, the greedy manager wants to force Donald to continue killing for him. Being a kind-hearted vampire, Donald isn't worried about bullets, but the manager's gun is actually a water pistol filled with holy water from a church, causing Donald to smoke and sizzle upon contact. At this moment, Sally, who had been hiding in a coffin, emerges. Like the manager, she had long known Donald was a vampire and fell in love with him because of it. Talk about twisted. She's been hiding in her crush's house. To protect Donald, Sally agrees to the manager's indecent proposal. Seizing the opportunity, Donald slams the coffin lid down, knocking the manager unconscious. Although he intends to drain the manager dry, he hears noises outside the door. With no time to waste, Donald stashes the unconscious manager in the coffin and hides with Sally. Moments later, Van Helsing and the police officer arrive. Seeing the manager in the coffin, Van Helsing is convinced he's the vampire. Despite the manager's desperate pleas, Van Helsing drives a stake through his heart, ending his life. The group leaves the scene, abandoning the mess behind. In the end, Sally admits she finds Donald's life thrilling and exciting. She asks him to turn her into a vampire, and they live happily ever after. The ninth story begins with Chubby and his two sidekicks having been best friends since childhood. One evening, after watching a movie, they were walking home, animatedly discussing the plot, unaware that a figure in black was watching them from a distance. Suddenly, the figure descended upon them, causing the trio to scatter in terror. Just as Chubby found himself cornered, the figure in black burst into laughter and removed his cloak. It was their friend with a camera. The prank left Chubby shaken. One of them suggested that since they all loved horror movies so much, why not make one themselves? The others eagerly agreed, and they decided to shoot the film at the local funeral home. The funeral home was empty, but a single corpse caught their attention. When they lifted the white sheet, they were shocked to find it was the town's beloved librarian who had always been kind to them. His death was a great loss. Suddenly, they heard a noise outside and hid in panic. The funeral home director entered but didn't seem suspicious of the exposed body. Instead, he began to speak to the corpse with a disturbing affection. He lamented when the freaks like them would stand up since they had their own moments of brilliance. He then began to process the body. The gruesome scene with the corpse's organs being sucked into a machine didn't stop him from enjoying a midnight snack. Chubby, hiding in a coffin, couldn't help but open it for air. The director approached, ready to lift the lid, but the friend, hiding behind the curtains, made a noise to distract him. The director, not noticing anything amiss, was interrupted by the doorbell. Taking advantage of the distraction, the four friends fled through the back door, though Chubby didn't make it out in time and had to hide under the coffin. The visitor was the town's pharmacist. The director and the pharmacist had a deal. The pharmacist sold faulty medications, causing customers to die quickly, ensuring new business for the funeral home. As a return, the pharmacist took a cut of the funeral fees. It's clear that this wasn't their first time working together. Chubby couldn't see the pharmacist's face, but noticed his snakeskin shoes. The pharmacist mentioned that he had given a wealthy local businessman a toxic asthma medication, meaning they would soon have more business. The next day, Chubby told his friends what he had seen, but no one believed him. Then the camera boy tearfully revealed that his father had died suddenly the night before from an asthma attack, despite always taking his medication on time. Realizing the businessman was the camera boy's father, the friends decided to expose the director and the pharmacist's crimes using the boy's camera. They searched the town's pharmacies and found the one with the pharmacist in snakeskin shoes. Chubby then distracted the funeral home director with another prank, allowing the others to sneak into his office. They found invoices revealing the director's immense profits, with only a small portion going to the pharmacist. They left the invoices at the pharmacy's door. Realizing he had been cheated, the pharmacist confronted the director. The director, ruthless as ever, attacked the pharmacist with a hammer and forced him to drink a toxic concoction, killing him. Unbeknownst to him, the friends had recorded the entire incident. Surrounded, the director showed no fear and threatened them with a knife, demanding the tape. In the ensuing chase, he accidentally backed into the organ processing machine. His organs were sucked into the machine, leaving him feeling hollow. As he took his last breath, the librarian's corpse seemed to smile. The 10th story takes place late at night, when a hungry homeless man was rummaging through a trash heap for food. Despite being destitute, he always shared his meager finds with his friend who was weakened by years of heavy drinking and was in poor health. The homeless man ventured out to seek help for him, but no sooner had he stepped out of the alley than he heard his friend's anguished screams. Rushing back, he found only his friend's severed hand. Terrified, he fled the alley, inadvertently leaving a bloody handprint at the scene. The scene shifts to a charming journalist, Dale, who brought a different girl home every night for some hormone exercise. However, Dale was a heartless player, kicking the girls out right after. The news of the homeless man's murder had spread across the town, and Dale and a colleague were sent to the cemetery to gather information. In a bid to secure an exclusive scoop, Dale locked his colleague in the restroom. There was a charity organization in town called the Homeless Shelter. Oddly, this institution didn't cater to living homeless people, but provided free funeral services for those who had passed away. Their spokesperson, Jess, was stunning, and Dale was smitten at first sight. Due to his failure to secure exclusive stories, Dale's boss fired him. Dejected, Dale returned home, only to find there was a power outage. The homeless man, now a wanted fugitive, had taken refuge in Dale's home. The bloodstain at the scene had led the police to identify him as his friend's killer, and his details were all over the newspapers. The homeless man pleaded with Dale to write an article proving his innocence. He revealed that his friend would be buried the next day under the arrangements of the homeless shelter. All Dale had to do was stay at the cemetery to uncover the truth. The next day, Dale attended the man's funeral and ran into Jess again. Bewitched by her elegance, Dale invited her to lunch, but being broke, he took her to his home. Jess, however, said she didn't eat meat and nibbled on a piece of vegetable the entire time. After lunch, they ended up in bed. Midway through their 2-minute tryst, Jess discovered a tape recorder by the bed. It turned out Dale had used the lunch as a pretext to extract information from Jess, suspecting that the homeless shelter was up to something sinister. Furious, Jess felt betrayed. She had thought she found true love, only to realize Dale was a manipulative jerk. Jess asked if Dale had ever loved her, but Dale retorted her. Jess stormed out, vowing revenge. Late that night, Dale went to the agreed meeting spot with the homeless man, who was now gravely injured. The man repeatedly asked if Dale had seen the truth. Dale replied that the cemetery was just filled with graves and corpses. There was no truth to be found. The homeless man, with his dying breath, muttered that Dale should have stayed longer before collapsing. With the homeless man dead and no exclusive story in hand, a financially strained Dale spent his last few dollars on a bottle of liquor, collapsing in the pouring rain. The next day, a filthy Dale returned to his workplace, begging for his job back, only to find his colleague had already taken his place. Defeated, Dale walked away in disgrace. The homeless man's body was scheduled to be buried tonight. Dale planned to stay at the cemetery to uncover the truth the homeless man had spoken about during his life. A few hours later, Dale witnessed the ground at the cemetery collapse before his eyes. He hurried over and dug through the dirt, but the coffin containing the body had vanished, leaving only a large door behind. Curiosity piqued. Dale opened the door, revealing a mysterious cellar filled with coffins. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching from a distance. Unable to climb back up, Dale quickly hid in one of the coffins. The corpse inside gave Dale quite a scare. Before he knew it, he was being carried away along with the coffin. When he next opened the coffin, he found himself on a grand dining table surrounded by elegant cutlery and walls adorned with terrifying portraits. The head of the homeless shelter informed Dale that they had been eating human flesh for some time. Due to a recent food shortage, they had been forced to step out onto the streets. Dale was horrified to discover that the shelter was actually a group of ghouls. Even more shocking was the revelation that Dale's colleague was one of them. They tore off Dale's ear and ate it with sauce. The door slowly opened, and Dale's former lover, Jess, walked in. Desperately, Dale cried out for her help, but Jess revealed that she, too, was a ghoul. She had only pretended to be a vegetarian to deceive Dale. Amidst his screams, Dale became the ghoul's next meal. Rather than saying Dale died from curiosity, it is more accurate to say he died because of his promiscuity. Jess had genuinely liked Dale and had refrained from harming him when they were alone. If Dale had not toyed with her emotions, he could have avoided becoming food. The 11th story begins with a beautiful bartender named Liz, who was aptly described as having the face of an angel and the body of a devil. Because of this, she often attracted unwanted attention from creepy men. One day, a drunk customer tried to force Liz to go for a drive with him. Just as she struggled to break free, a bald customer with a bald gun intervened and rescued her sexy body. In truth, Liz enjoyed watching men fight for her. The brave and wealthy bald man quickly won her heart, and they soon married and moved in together. The bald man owned a decent-sized logging company and spoiled Liz. However, his employees mocked her behind his back, calling her a second-hand woman. One night, their laughter almost reached the bald man. He declared that women were trouble and that no one could bring a woman to the mountain except for his wife, Liz. At that moment, Liz, dressed provocatively, walked into the dormitory to remind the bald man that breakfast was ready. Her attire made her look like a lamb among wolves, and the bald man angrily pulled her aside, not wanting his employees to ogle his wife. He told her to stay away from the dormitory in the future. To the employees, Liz was a disgraced woman. One particularly rude employee made a snide comment, and the bald man, losing control, beat him bloody, declaring that no one could insult his hairy wife. Despite his defense of her, Liz started to feel restless in her marriage. She believed marriage should not restrict her freedom and wanted to have fun. Gradually, Liz grew tired of married life. The incident had made the employees too scared to even greet her, leaving her feeling lonely. Then a young, handsome man named Ted came to apply for a job as a lumberjack. Liz couldn't help but gulp at his fine features and muscles. Ted was very capable, chopping thick logs with ease, which made Liz's heart flutter. Taking advantage of the bald man's absence, Liz invited Ted to her bedroom and tried every trick to seduce him into a hormone yoga session. She assumed a young man would be easy to tempt and lasted long, but Ted, being a gentleman, quickly escaped her advances and left. The frightened Ted, in an attempt to avoid Liz, even considered resigning. His colleagues advised him not to quit over such a trivial matter, especially since he was supposed to represent them in the town's annual logging competition. While everyone was drowning their sorrows in alcohol, their bald boss stormed in to flex his bald head, raging with anger. He had found Ted's logging gloves in Liz's bedroom. The boss loudly demanded to know who had touched his hairy wife. Surprisingly, the employees did not betray Ted. Instead, they reprimanded the bald boss, saying he had changed since marrying Liz. After much contemplation, Ted decided it was best to leave this place of trouble. Liz, unwilling to let this handsome man go, threatened Ted. If he didn't exercise with her, she would report him to the bald boss. Under pressure and seduction, even the resolute Ted lowered his moral defenses. Just as they were in the midst of their smelly affair, the bald boss burst in, flexing his bald head. Liz quickly distanced herself from Ted and accused him of forcing himself on her. The enraged bald boss ignored Ted's explanations and started beating him mercilessly. He used an axe to severely injure Ted, leaving him barely alive. Though Ted survived, he was left blind. His young life turned dark, and his colleagues deeply regretted his fate. To avenge Ted, they captured the bald boss and Liz, gagged them, and stuffed them into logs. They then handed Ted a chainsaw, suggesting he practice cutting through the logs. Unaware of the true contents of the logs, Ted, guided by his colleagues, picked up the chainsaw. Even blind, he expertly operated the tool. Blood splattered on his face, causing him to smile with eerie excitement. The bald boss was soon sawed to death, while the colleagues cheered wildly. Liz, trapped in the other log, trembled in fear. The 12th story begins with Charles, who was a reporter for a newspaper, willing to do anything to get a story. However, his alcoholism had once cost him his job. Unemployed, Charles wandered from bar to bar in the slums. Once a renowned journalist who had interviewed countless celebrities and tycoons, he now found himself in a dingy bar, a stark contrast that drew sighs from onlookers. While Charles was venting his frustrations, a beautiful woman caught his attention. He quickly approached her, and noting her beauty, he asked if she was a prostitute. Surprisingly, this insulting probe didn't anger the woman. She introduced herself as Vicky. Charles responded his nickname is Encyclopedia. In the adult world, things are simple. No need to delve into each other's backgrounds. After a night of passion, Charles invited Vicky to lunch. Unexpectedly, Vicky stated that their relationship was over. She enjoyed being with different men every day, but acknowledged Charles's good performance and non-clingy nature, suggesting they could meet again. Unlike Vicky's carefree lifestyle, Charles had fallen for her. Determined to be worthy of her, he returned to the newspaper office, pleading with his boss for another chance. He needed a respectable job and insisted he had quit drinking for good. The boss decided to give Charles a trial period on the condition that he delivers a big story to prove himself. After leaving the newspaper office, Charles went to his ex-wife's house as usual to beg for $500 from his impoverished ex-wife. He then used the money to treat Vicky to dinner and fun, boasting to everyone that he had quit drinking. Charles even planned to buy earrings for Vicky with the money he had begged from his ex-wife. However, Vicky didn't want Charles's gifts. She thought their current relationship was just fine as it was. Back at the newspaper office, Charles worked very hard but still couldn't uncover the big news he was looking for. Frustrated, Charles returned to the bar and ordered a drink. The bartender earnestly advised Charles not to fall back into his old habits, reminding him how hard he had worked to find a job and return to a normal life. Persuaded by the bartender, Charles reluctantly went across the street to a Greek restaurant for a cup of coffee. The restaurant owner, full of negative energy, started ranting to Charles about bureaucrats, society, and his wife. After venting, the owner went alone into the kitchen, and shortly after, the sounds of a heated argument between a man and a woman erupted, followed by a cacophony of pots and pans clashing. Then, everything went silent. Curious, Charles went into the kitchen to check. He found a woman lying on the ground. Witnessing what seemed to be a murder, Charles realized this could be the big news he had been seeking. He quickly took out his notepad to interview the restaurant owner. The owner confessed in tears that his wife loved to fool around. He had hired a private detective to follow her and discovered that she was indiscriminate, sleeping with everyone from wealthy tycoons to homeless men. In a fit of rage, he had accidentally strangled her during an argument. Charles was about to call the police when the woman on the ground regained consciousness. To his shock, she turned out to be his lover, Vicky. Desperate not to lose his big scoop, Charles strangled Vicky with his own hands. After committing the murder, Charles grabbed a bottle of alcohol and, while drinking heavily, eagerly called the newspaper office to report the big news he had just created, hoping to reclaim his former glory. The scene shifts, and Charles is now locked up. He's in a straitjacket, earnestly recounting the story he just told, ending with a mutter about wanting a drink. The story ends here, leaving us to wonder why Charles was dreaming of his comeback one moment, and the next, he was locked up. What happened in between? Since the prisoners wear prison uniforms, not straitjackets, it suggests that Charles is not in a prison but a mental hospital. Charles is an alcoholic and a schizophrenic. He fell in love with the beautiful Vicky and murdered her, then fabricated an entire story in his delusion. In this story, Vicky is a promiscuous woman who broke her honest husband's heart, perhaps easing Charles's guilt over the murder by making it seem more justified. The 13th story begins with a wife, disheveled and rushed, arrives at her husband's company. The moment she walks in, she starts groping him, attempting to initiate a vigorous and sweaty session right then and there. Her husband, busy with work, pushes her heavy body away. Furious, she storms out and vows to get back at him. She starts flirting with one of his subordinates, and faced with the advances of the boss's wife, the subordinate doesn't resist. Soon, they are entangled in an affair. The scene shifts, revealing that the previous events were just scenes from a Daniel C.C. drama. Two housewives watch on, moved to tears by the wife's infidelity. Janet has a husband who is similarly absorbed in his work, neglecting her for a long time. For someone like Janet, who has been out of touch with society for years, she yearns to be as bold and vengeful as the wife in the show. Janet's husband is a doctor who, after coming home from work, heads straight to his lab without interacting much with her. She fantasizes about her husband putting aside his work to pay more attention to her. Taking cues from the TV show, Janet starts to flirt and seduce her husband. However, he is deeply engrossed in researching a new anesthetic and has no interest in her. To him, even a rabbit is more entertaining than his wife. Disappointed, Janet continues to watch the show while working out. In the show, the main character is caught cheating by her husband, who pulls out a gun for revenge. Just then, the TV signal cuts out, much to Janet's dismay. At that moment, a neighbor comes over and tells Janet that the husband in the show shot the woman's lover in a very sensitive area, and now the husband is likely headed to jail. Janet complains about the TV losing signal at the crucial moment. The neighbor suggests that Janet get cable TV, which would offer more channels and enrich her leisure time. The next day, a cable TV technician arrives at Janet's house. The strong and handsome technician stirs feelings in Janet, who hasn't interacted with a man in a long time. Even a few casual remarks from the technician make her daydream. With nothing else to occupy her, Janet puts on some sexy clothes and goes to her husband's lab to seduce him again. Her husband, focused on his critical research, asks Janet to wait a few more days. When he rejects her advances, Janet throws a tantrum, accidentally breaking some of his lab equipment. Furious, her husband throws her out. Feeling neglected, Janet decides to seek excitement elsewhere. She calls the technician over to fix the TV late at night, but indeed to fix her hormones. The technician, no saint himself, recognizes the setup from movies and takes the cue. They end up in bed together. 2 minutes later, they finish their yoga session as expected, and after the technician leaves, Janet's husband emerges from the lab. Noticing the TV is still not fixed, he suggests calling the technician back the next day. Once he's back in the lab, Janet calls the technician over again to fix not the TV, but her body. This time, her husband unexpectedly returns. Scrambling to get dressed, Janet tells her husband that the technician is there to fix the TV, just as he suggested. Her husband, suspecting nothing, returns to his lab. For the next 7 days, Janet and the technician indulge in their affair, living a life of hedonistic pleasure. On the 15th day, the husband's research finally succeeded. Excited, he emerged from his lab to share the good news with Janet, only to stumble upon her in the midst of an affair. He didn't confront them, but retreated to his lab, clutching his pet rabbit. He thought in despair, not knowing what to do with his wife's cheating. After wrestling with his thoughts, the husband decided to use his newly developed anesthetic to knock out both his wife and her lover. He then performed a series of complex surgeries on them. The operations were highly successful, and the anesthetic worked perfectly, keeping them unconscious for 15 days. After the surgeries, he moved them back to the couch. When they woke up, they laughed and chatted, thinking they had merely fallen asleep. But when the lights turned on, Janet screamed. Her furious husband had performed a head swap surgery on them, claiming that since they wanted to possess each other's bodies, now they had their wish. The 14th story begins in 1918 when an army was fiercely battling the Germans. Amidst the chaos of whistles and gunfire, countless soldiers were falling. A sergeant stumbled upon Corporal Martin, who was hiding and drinking alone. The sergeant accused him of drinking while the Germans were firing at them. The sergeant wanted Martin to lead an assault on the hill, but Martin insisted on a retreat. Reluctantly, the sergeant launched the signal flare for retreat. In the command post, the general was discussing the next strategy with his staff when a soldier reported that their mountain counterattack had failed because the general's son, Martin, had ordered a retreat. The general was stunned. His son, in whom he had placed high hopes, was treating the battlefield like a game. The general immediately ordered another squad to support the assault, only to find their line had been cut. The soldier then reported that the squad was gone and he would never get them back. Their communication line had been destroyed in the battle. The general decided to send Martin to repair the line. Martin, a coward, always thought of retreating when on the battlefield, let alone repairing a line under German eyes. Furious, the general berated Martin for his actions. Martin protested that he didn't want to kill or see his soldiers die. He even hoped his father would discharge him. The general agreed on one condition. Martin had to complete this mission, after which he would be reassigned to a logistics position, away from the front lines. Martin took a small squad of scouts to the site, but the proximity to the German lines terrified him. Refusing to advance further, the sergeant took the lead with the soldiers to repair the line, giving Martin a whistle to alert them if the Germans approached. The soldiers crawled one by one towards their destination. While they were busy repairing the line, Martin saw German troops approaching. He wanted to blow the whistle to warn his comrades, but hesitated, knowing the sound would reveal his position. Choosing cowardice once again, he watched as his fellow soldiers were wiped out before his eyes. The severely injured sergeant, barely alive, was blown into the trench by enemy fire. He repeatedly questioned Martin why he didn't blow the whistle. Martin abandoned him and ran back to the camp alone. He tearfully told the general that they had been ambushed by the Germans and that despite his efforts to shoot at the enemy, he couldn't save his comrades. The general comforted his son, saying he did his best. At least he proved he was not a coward. But to their surprise, the gravely wounded sergeant returned and exposed Martin's lies, recounting how Martin had left them to die. After revealing the truth, the sergeant collapsed and died in anger. If Martin had blown the whistle, perhaps none of them would have died. Martin frantically defended himself, claiming he had been shooting at the Germans the whole time. However, when the general checked Martin's gun, not a single bullet was missing. Enraged, the general slapped Martin and handed him over to the military court. As expected, Martin was sentenced to death for dereliction of duty and desertion. Before the execution, the general removed Martin's shoelaces to prevent him from killing himself in his cell. That night, the general visited his son in his cell. Martin had never wanted to be a soldier. His father had forced him onto the battlefield. For his father's sake, he had given up his dreams and accepted a life that wasn't his own. The general told Martin that as his father, he would load the executioner's gun with blanks. After the execution, he would arrange for Martin to escape. The condition was that Martin, who was now seen as a coward, would need to face his execution like a man. Believing it was just an act, Martin agreed to his father's plan. Before the execution, Martin refused to be blindfolded and gave a passionate speech, saying he had tried his best, but he could never become a hero like his father. With his speech finished, the execution proceeded. Overcome with grief, the general closed his eyes. It was only at the moment of his death that Martin realized his father had deceived him. An aide reported that Martin died bravely, and the general responded coldly that his son was not a coward. Martin was dead, and the flask his father had given him lay discarded nearby. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.